The battery in your future car might not run on lithium at all. It might run on salt. Ordinary, table salt. And the country that just cracked it is the same one you already worry about controlling everything else. For 3 years, I kept a scoreboard. Lithium versus sodium. The West versus China. I had the West winning, comfortably, because every expert told me sodium batteries were a joke. Too weak, too heavy. A lab curiosity. Then I rechecked my numbers this spring, and the gap I thought I was tracking had already closed. The claim I'm going to defend is simple, and it sounds insane. China is now building a battery from one of the cheapest materials on Earth that could make the entire lithium supply chain, the thing the West spent a decade chasing, strategically irrelevant. Whoever owns the next battery owns the next century of energy, transport, and power grids. Stay with me, because there's a date hiding in a Chinese factory in Suzhou that reset my whole scoreboard. It's not a forecast. It's a production line that already exists, and it reaches your electricity bill, your car, and your country's place in the world. I remember the exact moment it stopped me. I was reading a CATL announcement from late April of this year, the launch of a brand called Naxtra, and I saw a sodium battery rated to work at 40 degrees below zero. I had written, in my own notes, 2 years earlier, that sodium couldn't survive a cold morning. I sat there and realized I'd been grading the race with the wrong stopwatch. Let me take you back, because to feel how fast this moved, you have to remember how certain everyone was that it would never move at all. For most of the last 20 years, sodium-ion batteries were the punchline. Sodium atoms are bigger and heavier than lithium atoms. That's just chemistry. A bigger, heavier ion shuffling in and out of a battery electrode stores less energy for its weight. So every engineer I read said the same thing. Lithium for anything that moves, because weight matters in a car. Sodium maybe, someday, for something that just sits there. The verdict felt permanent. And the West built its entire strategy on that verdict. Billions of dollars, enormous political capital, all poured into one bet: secure the lithium, mine it in Australia and Chile, process it, lock down the cobalt and the nickel. Every Western battery roadmap I tracked from 2019 onward assumed the same finish line. Win the lithium race, and you win the energy transition. Sodium wasn't even on the board. Here's the first number that made me uneasy. Sodium is not rare. It is roughly 1,000 times more abundant in the Earth's crust than lithium. You can pull it out of seawater. You can pull it out of ordinary rock salt. There is no Chile of sodium, no choke point, no single country sitting on the supply. And I remember thinking, if anyone ever makes sodium actually work, the whole map I've been studying becomes waste paper. So the only question that ever mattered was performance. Could sodium close the gap on lithium far enough to matter? For years, the honest answer was no. And then the answer quietly became yes. Let me give you the trajectory, because the trajectory is the real story. In July of 2021, CATL, the largest battery maker on the planet, the company that supplies Tesla and BMW and Volkswagen, held a launch event and unveiled its first-generation sodium-ion cell. The headline figure was an energy density of 160 watt-hours per kilogram. I wrote that down. And honestly, I shrugged. Good lithium iron phosphate cells at the time were already past 180, climbing toward 200. So sodium showed up to the race a full generation behind, exactly where everyone predicted. But here's what I missed, and it's the thing that should have set off the alarm. CATL didn't present that number as a finish line. They presented it as a starting line, and they put a roadmap behind it. Then I watched the second number arrive, and this is the one that broke my model. This April, CATL launched Naxtra as a real, mass production brand, not a lab sample. The new sodium cell came in around 175 watt-hours per kilogram. In under 4 years, sodium had climbed from a curiosity into the same range as the lithium iron phosphate batteries powering millions of cars on the road today. The gap I'd been tracking, the gap that justified the entire Western lithium bet, had shrunk from a generation to almost nothing. But energy density was never the whole scoreboard. And this is where I had to throw out my own assumptions. Because sodium doesn't just nearly match lithium in several ways that actually matter. It beats it. Cold weather. I told you about that -40 figure. A normal lithium battery in deep cold loses a brutal share of its range. Anyone who's driven an EV through a hard winter knows the dashboard lying to them. CATL claims its sodium cell holds the vast majority of its capacity at 40 below. That's not a marketing nicety. That's the difference between an EV being usable in Norway, Canada, or northern China and being a seasonal toy. Safety. Sodium cells are dramatically harder to push into thermal runaway, the chemical chain reaction behind battery fires. CATL ran nail penetration tests, overcharge tests, the abuse tests that make lithium engineers sweat, and the sodium cells stayed calm. For a grid full of these things sitting next to homes, that's enormous. And then the number that genuinely stunned me. Cycle life. The best sodium cells now being announced are rated for thousands of charge cycles. Some claims run past 10,000. A typical consumer lithium battery might give you somewhere between 1 and 3,000. If a battery lasts 3 or 4 times longer, the price per use collapses, even before you count the cheaper raw materials. So, let me update the scoreboard out loud, the way I had to in my own notes. Energy density. Sodium nearly caught up. Cold performance. Sodium ahead. Safety. Sodium ahead. Lifespan. Sodium potentially far ahead. Raw material abundance. Sodium, not even a contest. The only column where lithium still clearly wins is energy packed into the smallest, lightest space, and that column is shrinking every year. But none of that is the part that should worry the West. Because performance in a lab is one thing. The thing China has always been terrifyingly good at is the next step, and that's exactly where this race is about to run away. Here's the question I had to ask myself. Even if sodium works, can anyone build it at the scale that actually moves the world? A better battery that exists in a press release changes nothing. A better battery rolling off a production line by the gigawatt hour changes everything. And this is the gap that nobody outside the industry is talking about. Let me tell you about Suzhou. In an industrial zone in Suzhou, in Jiangsu province, a company called Huaihai partnered with BYD. China's electric vehicle giant has been building what was announced as one of the largest sodium-ion battery production bases in the world. The scale being targeted was on the order of 30 gigawatt hours a year. Let me put that number in human terms. 30 gigawatt hours is enough battery capacity for hundreds of thousands of vehicles every single year, from sodium, from salt, from a material nobody can blockade. And BYD is not alone. CATL, having launched Naxtra, has the manufacturing muscle to scale it across the same gigafactory network that already makes more batteries than the rest of the world combined. Haina Battery, a company spun out of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, has been deploying sodium-ion energy storage at grid scale. In Hubei province, a sodium-ion storage station measured in the hundreds of megawatt hours was brought online. Not a demonstration, a working piece of the power grid. Now sit with the comparison, because this is the heart of my scoreboard. While China was quietly building sodium production lines that already physically exist, where was the West's sodium industry? There were a handful of brave startups. There was one well-known British company, Faradion, that pioneered sodium-ion chemistry, and it was bought in 2022 by an Indian conglomerate. The actual manufacturing momentum, the factories, the supply chain, the scale-up, almost all of it concentrated in one country. The same country the West has spent a decade trying not to depend on for lithium. Do you see the trap? The West looked at the battery race and saw a single-track lithium and ran as hard as it could down that track. China ran down the same track too, and dominated it, by the way. China controls something like 2/3 to 3/4 of the world's lithium processing capacity. But while everyone watched the lithium track, China quietly built a second track, a salt track. A track with no foreign choke point, no price spike, no mine that another government can shut off. And here's why the timing of all this should make your stomach drop. If the pattern I've been tracking across these shifts, the solar story, the rail story, and now this feels like a framework worth having before the next factory announcement lands, that's exactly what I built China's Edge, deep capital and full stack around. Each of those books maps the same underlying logic, how manufacturing scale and materials strategy compound into geopolitical leverage before the headlines catch up. They're available in the description below, and if you've been keeping your own scoreboard on any of this, I think you'll recognize the methodology the moment you open the first page. Now back to the trap itself, because the timing isn't just about price charts. Remember the lithium price chaos? In late 2022, lithium carbonate spiked to roughly 80,000 US dollars per ton. Carmakers panicked. Then it crashed down to somewhere around $10,000 to $15,000 per ton. That violent swing is exactly the kind of supply shock that makes a stable, dirt-cheap alternative irresistible. Sodium carbonate, the raw input for these batteries, costs a small fraction of even cheap lithium, and its price barely moves. When you're planning a factory that has to run for 20 years, you don't want the exciting material. You want the boring one. Salt is gloriously, strategically boring. So, let me move the countdown. It is not a question of whether sodium scales. In China, it is already scaling. The only question left is how fast it eats into the markets the West assumed were locked up, and the honest answer, from my own tracking, is faster than my notes from even 2 years ago allowed for. But I promised you this reaches further than a factory in Jiangsu. So, let me turn the scoreboard around now and point it directly at you, because if you're watching this from outside China, this next part is about your job, your bills, and your country, not someone else's. Think about where this lands first. The least glamorous, most important battlefield isn't cars. It's grid storage, the giant banks of batteries that store solar power for the night and wind power for the still days. Every serious climate plan on Earth depends on storing renewable energy cheaply. For grid storage, weight doesn't matter at all. A battery the size of a shipping container can be as heavy as you like, which means the one column where lithium still wins energy per kilogram is the one column that's irrelevant here. In grid storage, sodium's lower cost, longer life, and superior safety aren't just competitive, they're decisive. So picture the next decade. The world races to build out renewable energy. It needs storage on a scale that's almost hard to comprehend. Trillions of dollars of batteries. If that storage runs on sodium, and the sodium battery industry lives overwhelmingly in China, then the West doesn't just import some panels. It rents the backbone of its own electricity system from a strategic rival. Every grid battery, every substation buffer, every backup bank built on Chinese salt battery technology. Now bring it closer to home, to the thing parked in your driveway. The knock on sodium for cars was always range, because of that weight penalty. But here's what's already happening. Chinese automakers are putting sodium batteries into smaller, cheaper city cars and into the enormous market for electric scooters, three-wheelers, and delivery vehicles. CATL has talked about sodium-ready vehicle platforms. And as the energy density climbs toward 200 watt-hours per kilogram, which is on CATL's stated roadmap, the range objection quietly dies for a huge slice of everyday driving. What does that mean for your wallet? It means China can build an electric car that is fundamentally cheaper to produce than anything a Western automaker can match, because the most expensive, most volatile component just got replaced with salt. We've already watched Chinese EVs undercut Western prices using cheap lithium iron phosphate. Sodium is the next twist of the knife. If you've wondered how some Chinese electric cars sell for prices that seem impossible, this is the engine behind the next wave of impossible prices. And think about the jobs. The West has been trying to build a domestic battery industry gigafactories, mining, processing, the whole chain pitched as the manufacturing future. The jobs that replace the old auto plant jobs. That entire pitch was built on lithium. If the center of gravity shifts to a chemistry where China already owns the factories, the patents, momentum, and the supply chain, then a lot of those promised Western jobs are being planned around a finish line that's quietly being moved. I want to be fair here, because I don't trust blind alarm any more than blind optimism, and I'd guess you don't either. Sodium will not erase lithium tomorrow. For high-performance, long-range vehicles, lithium's energy density still matters, and it'll keep that crown for years. The first generations of sodium cars will be modest, and some of the boldest claims, the 10,000 cycle numbers, the aggressive roadmaps, deserve to be checked against real-world results, not press events. I'm not telling you lithium is dead. I'm telling you the assumption that lithium was the only race, and that the West understood the map is the thing that's dead. Because here's what my scoreboard actually shows now, when I'm honest with it. The West won the lithium race, and may have won the wrong race. It secured the supply chain for a chemistry that's about to face a rival with no supply chain to secure, because you can't blockade salt. But I told you at the start there was one number that reset everything. One date hiding in this story that took my unease and turned it into something colder. Let me give it to you now, because this is the piece almost no one outside the industry has connected. Go back to that CATL launch this April and read past the headline energy density figure into the part that didn't make the splashy coverage. CATL didn't just launch a product. They committed to a production timeline. The plan put mass production of these next-generation sodium cells into motion this year, 2025, not as a pilot, not as a someday, but as a scheduled industrial ramp. And they paired it with a stated second-generation target of around 200 watt-hours per kilogram before the end of the decade. Now layer the dates the way I finally did, on one page. First-generation sodium cell, 160 watt-hours per kilogram, 2021. Mass production sodium brand, 175 watt-hours per kilogram, 2025. Target of 200 watt-hours per kilogram by the late 2020s. That's a chemistry the world dismissed, going from joke to par with today's mainstream lithium cells in roughly the span of a single product cycle. And it's not slowing down. The slope is still climbing. Here's the part that genuinely chilled me. I went looking for the equivalent line on the western side of my scoreboard. The mass production sodium timeline, the gigafactory, the announced output, the date. And there almost isn't one. The pioneering Western sodium company got absorbed abroad. The Western roadmaps I trust are still overwhelmingly lithium. So when I lined up the two columns, China's sodium production already ramping in 2025 against a Western sodium industry that mostly exists as ambition, the gap wasn't closing. On this second track, the race had barely started in the West, and China was already at industrial scale. That's the revelation that rewrote my notes. For years, I measured this race by who had the better lithium position, and by that measure, it was close and contested. But the real contest moved to a track most Western planners never put on their map. And on that track, by the time the rest of the world looks up and realizes sodium is real, the factories, the patents momentum, the trained workforce, and the cost advantage will already sit in one country. It's the same pattern I've now watched 3 times. Solar panels, the West invented the technology, China owns the manufacturing. High-speed rail imported the concept, then built more track than the entire rest of the planet combined. Now batteries, and not just the lithium ones everyone fought over, but the salt ones nobody was guarding. Each time, the West measured the race by who had the breakthrough. Each time, China understood that the breakthrough is the easy part, and the one who scales it is the one who wins. So when someone tells you a battery made of salt sounds too humble to matter, remember that humble is exactly the disguise these shifts always wear. The lithium spike that terrified car makers will fade from memory. The factory in Suzhou will not. The grid batteries going in across China right now, quietly, on sodium, will still be cycling cheaply and safely long after the headlines move on. And the cars built on this chemistry will keep arriving in your market, at prices your domestic makers will keep struggling to explain. I started this with the West winning on my scoreboard, comfortably, because that's what the experts told me, and that's what I wanted to believe. I don't have it that way anymore. I have a chemistry that was supposed to be impossible, hitting mass production this year, in a country that can't be cut off from its raw material, because the raw material is the ocean and the ground beneath our feet. I have a second track in this race that the West forgot to enter, and I have a date 2025 that turned a quiet lab story into the year. The salt battery stopped being a maybe. What stays with me isn't any single figure. It's the feeling of having watched a finish line move while I was still cheering for the wrong runner. Once you see that the race had 2 tracks all along, you can't go back to the comfortable version where the West was simply ahead. If you're the kind of person who'd rather have the real number than the reassuring story, the kind who wants to know where the race actually stands, not where it's flattering to assume it stands, then you already think the way this scoreboard is kept. So tell me where you land on this. That production line in Suzhou, targeting around 30 gigawatt hours a year of sodium batteries, while the West has almost no sodium factory to point to. Does that gap worry you? Or do you think lithium's energy density edge keeps the West safe longer than I'm saying? Drop your answer in the comments, and tell me which country you're watching from, because I genuinely want to see how this looks from your grid, your driveway, your part of the world. And if you want to track these shifts while they're still hiding in a factory announcement, instead of on the evening news before they land in your prices and your job market, this is the place that keeps the running. Count. Subscribe and stay with me, because the next number I'm chasing is the one CATL, buried in that same roadmap, the solid-state battery timeline that could make even this salt story look like a warm-up. I've started lining up those dates too, and the slope on that one is steeper than anything you've seen yet. Let me give you one more piece before you go, because it's the thing that ties the whole pattern together, and it's been sitting in my notes flashing red. While I was busy updating my sodium column, I noticed something about the way these announcements are timed. CATL didn't launch Naxtra in isolation. They launched it alongside their second-generation fast-charging lithium cells and a steady drumbeat of solid-state research milestones. That's not a company hedging a bet. That's a company running every track in the race at once, so that whichever chemistry wins, the factory that builds it is already theirs. I went back through my files and realized I'd been grading China on one breakthrough at a time, when the real strategy was to own the whole field of breakthroughs. And here's the number that made me close my laptop and just think for a while. China currently manufactures somewhere around 3/4 of the world's lithium-ion battery cells. Not design cells, the physical objects. Now imagine that same manufacturing dominance simply copied onto a second chemistry that needs no imported lithium, no cobalt, no nickel. That's not a company winning a product category. That's a country making itself the default supplier of stored energy for the planet, on 2 independent supply chains at once, with a third already in the lab. I keep coming back to how quiet all of it is. There was no dramatic announcement that the West had lost the sodium race, because the West never knew it had entered one. The most important industrial shifts almost never arrive with a siren. They arrive as a line in a quarterly report, a ribbon cutting in an industrial park most people couldn't find on a map, a price quote on a material so cheap nobody bothers to track it. By the time it's obvious, it's finished. So this is where my scoreboard sits tonight, and I'm not going to dress it up for you. On lithium, the race is close, and the West is in it. On sodium, the race is already most of a lap gone, and the West is mostly watching from the stands. On whatever comes after sodium, the starting gun hasn't even fired, and one runner is already stretching at the line. I used to think staying informed meant reading the news after it happened. Now I think it means watching the factories, the patents, and the boring materials nobody guards, because that's where the next decade is being decided, while the headlines look the other way. Stay with me, keep your eyes on the salt, and I'll keep updating the count. The next time the gap moves, you'll hear it here first, before it ever reaches the news that reaches everyone else. Here's where I have to stop, but inside the circle I keep going, with China's sodium battery scoreboard, generation by generation, picking up right where I left off. In there, you can ask me your own question, and I answer you myself. A real person, not a machine. And you won't be alone. So many folks like you are already inside with me. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime with one click. No risk. If a breakthrough like this one fascinates you, there's a lot more waiting right here. Subscribe and stay close, because I keep exploring China's biggest leaps, and the next one is coming soon.